balancing also reporting requirements and the ability to use assigned spectrum with some flexibility. I've also made the example before around power, the rules around tower sitting. Flexibility is key, understanding that there is a temporary change of rules, but there is a need for flexibility in that moment. Regulators and customs and immigration agencies should build an emergency response plan that allow fast-track approvals for equipment importation and entry personnel. Again, key aspect. Most often the material and the infrastructure is there sitting in an airport but cannot be shipped into the last mile because of custom duties issues. National level agencies should establish clear lines of communication with regional and local agencies on telecommunications matters to prevent working at cross purposes or sending mixed or conflicting messages to operators. And finally, government should encourage operators to cooperate with one another to use available resources intelligently and efficiently. It goes back to the point that previously was made by Cable and Wireless, I suppose. Above all, I think the point around flexibility is key. So it's a key takeaway that I would like to take on board today. Regulation should allow flexibility on the issues that we have seen. Operators need to adjust to unforeseen circumstances rather than insisting that rules designed for non-emergency situation apply regardless of the circumstances. So it's a temporary change, but it needs to be allowed for quicker recovery. We also have some examples here. Again, next slide. Yes. Oh, I'm giving you some example of what flexibility means in practice, just referring to some real-world case studies that our team, our disaster response team has collected. These are examples of when various jurisdictions had enabled policies and regulation for improved disaster response. First one is from Japan, Ministry of Communication in response to the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. There was flexibility on allowing temporary increase in power level on certain sites to increase coverage range. Example again is temporary. Second one from Turkey, FAAD is the Turkish Disaster Management Authority. In 2011, with the Turkish earthquake, the relaxation of privacy laws upon the request to allow Turkcell to help to geolocate missing persons trapped under the rubble. So the possibility to identify people that were under the rubble by basically foregoing for a temporary period privacy rules that were preventing geolocation of specific SIM cards, for obvious reasons, privacy reasons. Simple things like this. Thirdly, Philippines financial regulators relaxing know your customer rules or KYC rules, requirements that were enabling people accessing government to person payments after the typhoon in 2013. So you know, in the Philippines, there is a wider base of mobile money, mobile wallet. Government would pass on funds to people directly, but you had to show your ID card, you had to show your credentials for this to happen. In this event specifically, government relaxed this requirement for this period, so enabling people to receive cash assistance via mobile money. So these are all simple things, and as you can see, it's not just about telecom regulators or communication ministry. It's wider than that. It's about privacy authorities, it's about financial regulation. So that's where the effort in terms of coordination is. A quick overview on the situation here. I mean, again, I have no intentions to teach you anything, because obviously you lived on your skin, so you know a lot better than I do what happened here. Um, on this slide, really, what I would like to focus on is the fact that the two hurricanes have left an impact of, you know, different different level in different parts of the regions. And when you quantify it, you quantify it in terms of the number of towers. So there has been moderate impacts in some of the islands like Bahamas, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Guadeloupe. So where just several towers went down, but mobile operators were able to recover relatively quickly. We're talking about days or weeks. High impact is identified for, you know, other territories when the damage to mobile sites is between 60 to 80% of the towers. So there's a substantial damage, which obviously impacts the network dramatically. It will take weeks to recover. And in the end, extreme impacts in other islands such as Barbuda, San Martin, Dominica, Puerto Rico, the loss of more than 90% of mobile sites, and ongoing power outages, fuel shortages, extreme situation to be able to restore that actually has taken and will take months. So what are the lessons so far that we have learned from our team on the ground here? Lack of power. How are we doing with time? We're still in time. I think so. Lack of power, critically. Without power, the networks cannot operate. Extreme, up to 95% damage to the network infrastructure. Disrupted road infrastructure, air travel, fuel shortages, cut fiber, and security and stuff on site. Again, that's an example on this last point on security where prevention and planning can help. Uh, in some circumstances, our members were not ready for these disasters, and obviously they did not have the right resources. Sometimes sites were equipped with fuel for running generators, but fuel was stolen, or the van that was carrying the fuel was attacked. So putting at risk the safety of people as well, and obviously problem with theft. So other issues, the lack of engineering accommodation, and obviously this is well, a list that has come from direct feedback from our members. Lack of basic supplies, shortage of critical parts, compounded impact on second hurricane coming back immediately after. The multi-market impacts, obviously some of our members operate in many of these countries. So they didn't have an impact only on one single operation. They had multiple market operations that is even making things worse, because you've got engineers to fix the network. They cannot be at the same time in two different places. So a strain on resources and a multi-country impact also, which is, you know, different angle to the same aspects. The reduced ability to stage responses, mainly also because of the nature of the territory being islands. So where to base the center of the logistic of assistance? There isn't a single point that can help all the affected regions. Potential solutions, namely the service provider aiming at offering a limited stock of emergency communication equipment that could be satellite phones or dedicated SIMs with dedicated traffic to be provided to government agencies and after disasters. Emergency legislation in place to make provisions for example, waiving of fees where that making sense. Work permits for staff dedicated to helping with the restoration, tax duties and relief for replacement of equipment, and also tower sitting and maintenance guidelines that include emergency preparedness plans to be implemented and regularly verified on site. So basically, again, if a tower goes down, that tower should be put up back again as quickly as possible without too many administrative processes when they are just after the disaster. Key regulatory areas that were flagged, again, the use of power limits for specific sites, obligations regarding reporting that were in some cases overwhelming, the obligations around minimum quality of service that obviously are almost impossible to meet when your network is down 60 to 80 or 90%, custom, roaming, and early warning management. So that's pretty much it from me. I think I'll finish. For more information, you can contact the disaster response team or myself. I guess the two key messages, again, just to reiterate, one is around the flexibility, which we have said many times, allow for temporary adjustment of situation, and particularly to issues like power and customs, and the possibility to reinstall towers as fast as possible. Also recognize that each single country has peculiarities and differences, and therefore coordination at national level is fundamental. These areas are addressed in more depth in other material that the GSMA disaster response program has. As I said, there is also a capacity building course on this, not the one I will do tomorrow, one specific on disaster response. So for those of you interested, please reach out to me or send an email to the disaster response team, and we will be very happy to help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for those, I think they were very practical suggestions or recommendations related to management in a disaster situation. And certainly you pointed out the preparation aspect, prevention and preparation, and putting procedures in place before, having them in place before the event, procedures and facilities in place before the event, which I think is probably the area that we need to work on as well. So consider your questions and post them into Keybait, and when we get to the discussion session, the Q&A, we can have them addressed. And I know there were a couple of people who also had some comments that they wanted to bring over from this morning, so you can get those ready as well. So moving from regulatory now to infrastructure, we are going to hear from OneWeb. Let me get my introduction thing here. We're going to talk about technologies for the communication recovery. I'm sorry. And our speaker is Ms. Mariah Schumann. And Mariah is the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at OneWeb. And I did have my my introduction here. Okay, here we are. And she's new to OneWeb. She joined them in 2017 as the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs. And I did meet Mariah, in fact, at the company, when she was still at the previous company that she worked for. She attended one of our Caribbean spectrum management sessions. I think it was Jamaica. Yes, in Jamaica. So now she's at OneWeb, doing regulatory affairs as Senior Director. And yes, she was at O3B at the time in the International Regulatory Affairs area. She now works on global licensing and policy advocacy for satellite services, earth stations, and spectrum access. And she served on the USA delegation for WRC 15. That's the World Radio Communication Conference, the ITU's World Radio Communication Conference. And she's actively involved in preparations for WRC 19, which of course we in the Caribbean are as well. And I think we'll be getting our preparations going in earnest in 2018. She has a JD from the Charleston School of Law and LLM in Communications and Information Policy from the American University, Washington College of Law. So she does regulatory affairs. So we will have a lawyer talking about the infrastructure. So it should be interesting. So please welcome Mariah to the podium.
Thank you, Nigel. And thank you so much for having me here. My second time in the Bahamas. I love this place, obviously. And it's been so wonderful to speak with many of you. Thank you for welcoming me. So I've been asked to speak about technologies for communication recovery, specifically LEO and MEO satellite systems. I should So before we get into details about the technologies, I'd like to take you through a few slides about OneWeb. So who is OneWeb? You may not have heard of us before. We're building a constellation of non-geostationary low Earth orbit satellites. The company was founded by Greg Weiler. You may have heard his name. He also founded O3B, a company where I previously worked. Greg's mission truly is to bring affordable internet access to the world. It's been the mission of both companies. We think of ourselves as a global communications company, not just a satellite company, and that's because we're technology neutral. So our customers would be ISPs, telcos, governments, mobile network operators. We are capacity backhaul or a direct to consumer, direct to school type of service. We'll launch our first satellites in 2018. We are building them right now through a joint venture with Airbus. And we also have other strong partners like Qualcomm, who is designing the chip technology for our equipment, and Intelsat and Hughes are also distribution partners. The first mission of OneWeb is to connect all of the schools in the world by 2022. So that's almost 4 years from now. Our statistics show that there are roughly 2 million schools in the world that are not connected. So it's a big endeavor, it's an aspiration, but it's something that we're honestly trying to do. And also to bridge the digital divide by 2027, so 10 years from now. Many are trying to do this, and we think that's excellent because it does take a diverse ecosystem, right? It takes cable, it takes wireless, it takes satellite. Everyone working together will honestly, hopefully achieve this goal. So now we'll get into a little bit of the infrastructure, and as a lawyer, I hope I can explain it well enough. So as I noted, we are building LEO satellite systems. Initially, we will have about 900 satellites. And I think it's important to look at the latency here. So traditional GEO satellites, that's the kind of satellites that will bring you satellite TV, sometimes broadband from providers like Hughes or Viasat. Those satellites are in geostationary orbit, which has a really high latency. So often when you hear about satellite, you think, oh, it's slow, and also it's expensive. So we've been trying to make advancements and make it less slow and less expensive. So with O3B, a MEO system was designed. So geostationary satellites are at the equator, right? They always point to one spot on the Earth at all times. MEO, medium Earth orbit satellites, are still at the equator, but they're much closer to the Earth. So the distance of the O3B system is close enough from the Earth that the human ear does not detect that it's a satellite. So if I called you from DC, I called you here over the O3B system, you wouldn't be able to know that I was calling over satellite. So we're fixing that problem of the latency. But O3B has a limited coverage area. Being at the equator, they can serve maybe 50 degrees north and south. So the next step is LEO, which is to move the satellites even closer to the Earth and cover the entire Earth. So our initial constellation of 900 satellites will be a web of satellites covering the entire globe. We have KU band and KA band spectrum that we're using to do this, and you can see our throughput numbers here. So to think about the latency, it says less than 50 milliseconds. That's round trip. So you think from an Earth station in the Bahamas to the satellite to a gateway Earth station, let's say in Florida, that, and then to go back to the satellite and back to the Bahamas, that's under 50 milliseconds. So this is a technology that is comparable to fiber. So that's great, right? But I know you want to know, what does it cost, right? Because that's the obvious question. And unfortunately, I'm not allowed to get into specific details of cost, but we know that this has to be a competitive service. It's not going to survive if it's just a wonderful service that's just as expensive as satellite has always been. So the goal is truly an affordable service, and I'll get into a few more details about how we're trying to achieve that in a moment. A little more about the benefits of the system before I speak about the disaster response efforts also. So because it's this web of satellites around the world, it's seamless. So there should be no dropped call, no dropped Skype, no dropped moment in your video game, no dropped important emergency communication, because the Earth stations are always handing off to the satellites in a very well choreographed manner. Also, these antennas on the ground need to be easily installed. So think about a direct TV dish. That's the kind of dish that we would put on a school, on a hospital, and it needs to be something that requires minimal training so that it can be easily deployed. As I noted, we have multiple options. We can go direct to a home, or we can work with ISPs and telcos, and the latter would be how we would start. We really need the strong partnerships of the existing service providers in the country to support our initial rollout efforts. Again, affordable internet to places where terrestrial is cost prohibitive to reach. So we're not designing the system just to compete in the urban areas. That would be easy enough to do, but that's not the goal of the company. So for example, in the US, our first service will be to Alaska. Alaska has been left behind in the US. And it's important to focus on the rural areas because that's what really leads to an increase in GDP. So if the cities are connected, there reaches a point where the cities cannot increase the GDP anymore, right? It's sort of maxed out. But when you bring connectivity out to the rural areas, that's what can really raise a country's GDP. So we have a statistic from the ITU that says for every 10% increase in internet penetration in a country, there's a 1.5% increase in GDP. So this is something that obviously is a benefit if we can make it work, and we hope that we can. The benefits, though, are not just the connectivity, right? It's what is the impact to the people. So thinking about applications that tie into what we've heard about Internet of Things and other presentations here, there are benefits to agriculture, financial inclusion, health, telehealth, teleeducation, government connectivity. Really, it reaches the whole community. And some of you may have heard from me in the past when I was at O3B. I wrote to you about cruise ships, right? Cruise ships are coming to the Caribbean. They're being connected up until the moment that they come into port in the Caribbean. So we know that these areas can be served, but we need to go beyond just serving the cruise ships. We want to actually serve the countries and serve the rural areas. Before I left, I reached out to my colleagues at Intelsat, Hughes, SES, and O3B so that I could hear what they're doing in the Caribbean. And there's something I'd like to raise is that in the US, the satellite industry promotes itself as being very strong on disaster response. Responses to disasters in the Caribbean is something that the industry uses to preserve access to spectrum. So a paper was just put together and filed at the FCC, listing all the things that satellite is doing for disaster response, and many of the examples are the Caribbean, and specifically Puerto Rico. So I would like to know, maybe later, if you feel like you're getting an adequate disaster response service from the satellite industry, noting that the industry is really speaking about this as a positive thing. So it's something on which I'd like your feedback. So what are the GEOs doing? Intelsat says that they are supporting search and rescue operations. They're connecting banks, they're connecting pharmacies, they're connecting mobile vehicles after disasters. Hughes says that they are bringing in satellite terminals to connect ATMs, to connect airports and hospitals. And usually these are supported with generator power because, as we heard from Stefano, power is an issue, as you well know, after a disaster. SES says that they're bringing in rapid deployment kits to set up Wi-Fi access points. And O3B, following the recent devastation in Puerto Rico, partnered with Google and the Loon project, their balloons, to restore 4G LTE coverage in Puerto Rico. So the Loons targeted cell coverage over the island, and O3B sent in a fiber-like terminal, right, that medium Earth orbit latency. So LEO is going to take those a step further. And the real change here is the equipment that communicates with the satellite. So we have some examples here of the prototypes for our user terminals. These can be fixed or mobile applications, and they are configurable to what the user needs. So we have the flat panel on the top left. That's something that would go on top of a truck, for example. You can see on the right, like a fire truck. Enterprise is something that would go on like, a mining operation. Also, small cells applications can go on towers, and then we have some early prototypes for residential and cellular backhaul. So what do these look like in practice? We have two examples. The first one is the rescue and recovery. So the way that this would work, if you see the fire truck there, one of those flat panel antennas would be built into the fire truck. And what that antenna does is gives you options for the local access. You can configure it. So you could connect an Ethernet, you could have radio, like push to talk, Wi-Fi or small cell. Really, it just depends on what you need. So as you can see there, the fire truck is connecting to the police car. The firemen are connecting to both of those. Then we also have another terminal that's connecting to an emergency operations center, or another terminal connecting to an NGO. All of those signals go to the satellite and then go to the OneWeb network and then are connected wherever that traffic needs to go. So with satellites, it's really interesting. You determine where the traffic needs to go. If it's voice backhaul, it goes in one direction. If it's internet, it goes in another direction. If it's a private network, it goes in another direction. This just depends on how the router ports are configured, essentially. So this is an example of the rescue and recovery type of infrastructure that OneWeb will offer. The next is slightly different. So same satellite, same OneWeb. I'll just go back to show what's the same. Satellite, OneWeb are the same, and there's a network there that's the same. But what's connected on the ground is different. So here you can see we're connecting to different kinds of antennas. These are tower antennas, or this is an antenna on a rooftop. So this is the kind of infrastructure that would be used to restore services or to back up services until terrestrial can be deployed, or if terrestrial is a little spotty after a disaster, satellite is there. So this supports businesses and supports public services. These terminals, this equipment could be stored in advance. So it's advanced planning in both situations, right? In the first situation, the advanced planning is you build the antenna into the truck or into the response vehicle. Here, maybe you keep this equipment in storage so it's not destroyed by the storm, but then it can be easily deployed after the storm, and that's immediate connectivity to the satellites that are up in the sky. And one thing, I just received an email this morning regarding CTEL, and I think that many of the countries here participate in CTEL are aware of it. CTEL is partnering with GVF on training for disaster response. I'm not sure if this has been discussed yet, but I just received an email about it this morning. So what GVF and CTEL would like to do is offer an online training course that trains people on how to install this equipment, and then creates a database of all the people who have been trained to install the equipment, so that after a disaster, when responders arrive, they know who they can reach out to help start setting up the equipment. So that's a resource that's available, and it's easy to install if it's this kind of equipment, right? Because it's just like that pizza box on a house, or something on a cell tower. So because I am a lawyer, I do want to talk a little bit about regulatory best practices. So I see on the website, and it's been discussed here as well, that the goal is a cohesive regional approach to an ICT agenda. So my perspective on this is a cohesive regional approach to regulatory frameworks. So having worked in this industry for about 5 years, I've sought satellite landing rights from a number of countries in the Caribbean. And each one has a different application procedure, a different license, a different review period, and it's all workable. But I would just like to note that, for example, seeking satellite landing rights in the Bahamas is different from Haiti, and that's different from the Dominican Republic. It may be helpful if there was harmonization about how to approach licensing satellites. And there is something to rely on here, and that's the ITU. So the ITU has these internationally agreed upon standards and rules that satellite operators must comply with. And in our case, NGSO satellites comply with these rules to protect GSO satellites. All satellites comply with these rules to protect terrestrial operations. It's through power limits from the satellite. So I would encourage maybe a collective approach looking to the ITU and just making sure that the satellites are complying with the ITU rules, and that could limit some of the administrative procedures in each country. And so what we would encourage is the open skies policy, which is having no requirement for specifically the satellite landing rights parts, but absolutely requiring licenses for the earth stations on the ground that communicate with the satellites, because I understand that there are co-frequency services and there's coordination that must happen. In conclusion, this is a really exciting system. I saw O3B succeed where many thought that it would not. There were a lot of jokes made, O3B is not going to make it. I saw that company in 4 years go from 0 satellites to 12 satellites to 30, 40 customers when I left in 30 countries. And I've seen like the real impact that it can make on people's lives. Children connected to Skype for the first time, people accessing YouTube for the first time. So I left that successful company to come to OneWeb to do the whole thing again, starting before launch, right? Hopefully I've learned a few things along the way so I can be better and not make as many mistakes this time. But I think that this is really something that's possible. And we've spoken with a few different countries about pilot programs and getting things started, and trying to find some information about which schools are connected and how the schools are connected and how we can become a part of those plans. So I really would welcome your input and feedback and further conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariah. I think you did okay for a lawyer. Yeah. We'll have one more speaker on the topic before we get back to the questions and discussions, and that would be Secretary General Bernadette Lewis, and she'll be giving us her thoughts on fostering ICT-enabled Caribbean development, resilience, and recovery. Is a topic, in fact, that we've been having some consistent discussions on at the CTU Secretariat since the events in hurricane season this year, and we'll hear from the SG now. Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you, Greg. You need to blow it. Right, good afternoon, everyone. In July this year, we've been talking within the Secretariat about, disasters and so on and so forth. And in July of this year, we called the representative for the IARU East Division to come in and have a talk about ham radio and how they are set up to respond to disaster situations. And he made a request to us, that we seek to have our ministers sign on to a protocol that would enable ham operators to move from country to country with their equipment. So this was in July, but who would have thought that by September, we would have seen the devastation of the hurricanes Irma and Maria in the region. And it became apparent at that time too, that there were a number of deficiencies in how we approached this whole issue of disaster preparedness, mitigation, and recovery. One of the things that we recognized was that a lot of work has to be done with ham operators because they are the bedrock for communications in disaster situations. And the plan is to really work with the IARU to cultivate a new generation of ham operators. And that's just one aspect of it. When I look at the Tampere Convention, there are a couple of areas that do not well, it's a convention, it's a global convention, but the recognition of the peculiar challenges of the small island states, small island developing states, I don't think that is appreciated or recognized in that Tampere Convention, because it does not exactly cater for multiple countries being simultaneously devastated, so that the reporting, how you report in such a situation is not clearly apparent, and what is laid out in the convention doesn't exactly work for that sort of situation. Nevertheless, we've been talking since we've been doing a lot of talking and thinking through and trying to understand how ICTs can be effectively leveraged in such situations, and not just for disaster preparation and mitigation and recovery, but also for sustainable development. Because as someone mentioned, every time a hurricane hits and devastates a country, that country can be set back for decades. So what you have to do is ensure that the recovery is rapid. I don't know that we have infrastructure that could withstand 200 or 250 miles per hour winds, but we have to ensure that what we put down can can facilitate rapid recovery. And with that, I'm just going to go into my presentation. My friend from Digicel, I believe, Corinne, yesterday, she started off with, yes, welcome to the Caribbean, the glorious white sand beaches and turquoise waters and all the wonderful things, the calm, the friendliness and warmth of the people. It's wonderful. But we have some clouds. We have some dark clouds hovering over us. And certainly, we are vulnerable in many, many areas by virtue of our size. The majority of CTU members have less than 200,000 people. The countries, many of the countries are small. They are just mountain peaks, volcanic mountain peaks rising up out of the water. We are challenged with weak economies, and that is, on the one side. And then we're exposed to natural disasters, earthquakes, and of course, we are seeing the hurricanes have just been a fact of Caribbean life. And we are a very vulnerable region. Right. So, And of course, we heard about the devastation and the very violent hurricane season that we had in 27. And we also spoke to the destruction, businesses, all the things. These have already been captured by our earlier speakers. So I'm just going to breeze through this to the point of 21st century government. And I am thinking of the countries that were 90% of the buildings destroyed and so on, Dominica, British Virgin Islands, San Martin. How do they protect themselves from the ravages of a hurricane of that magnitude? Could you imagine if all of your government information is in ledgers, in filing cabinets, in boxes, on paper, and a devastating hurricane hits, you would lose all of your citizens' records, all of your records, all of your paper records are going to go. So we are proposing that governments move to digitizing all of their information, everything about government, all your information on your citizens, your infrastructure, everything digitized. This is the move. This is what we call 21st century government, so that there will be a digital profile for your country, and all of the information associated with your country is housed in repositories, not just on island or in the country, but you have duplicated databases in other countries. So in the event of a hurricane that wipes out all of your paper records, well, it shouldn't be there. If a devastating hurricane or natural disaster, your information is intact. It is resident. Somewhere you have not lost it, and it is a case now of repatriating it when you have your systems up and in place. So this is one of the things I believe that governments absolutely must do: maintain a digital information profile for every aspect of your country. And the next slide, it's a little busy, but we have heard of it, about what needs to be done from our earlier speakers. And this speaks to the relationships that need to be established. Yes, now if you notice on the slide, there are certain levels of relationship. So I've broken this one up into regional and international and national at the national level. And of course, in the Caribbean, we have SEDEMA, they report to CARICOM, and I'm hoping that these relationships truly exist. They should be charged with setting up the relationships with international response and other agencies. So I'm talking about the Red Cross, the satellite companies, the ITU. Those relationships have to be established before an emergency happens, right? And it is imperative that you have the contact details for the people that you're going to need to contact in the case of a hurricane, and that the reporting lines are established and documented and well understood by all parties, so that when the disaster strikes, you know who to call in this agency. They know who the people with which they have to liaise to get the information to the right agencies, and to help in the supporting the rescue and recovery and rebuilding process. So these relationships have to be established beforehand. That is on the sort of regional and national level. On the national level, you need to establish those reporting lines, those reporting functions for all the agencies that are involved in disaster mitigation and recovery. So your National Emergency Management Agency, your Ministry of National Security, your Ministries of Works, and all the other national response agencies. there must be a plan. When disaster hits, this is what must happen. And it would be ideal if you have an emergency operating center, or maybe even two or centers that are built to withstand hurricanes and would have all the necessary utilities to ensure continuous operation while the disaster is ensuing. So we recommend, and I think coming out of the devastation in Barbuda, there was a solar power plant, I think it was Penn Energy, and they were advertising the fact that their solar installation withstood the fury of the hurricane, right? And if theirs could do it, we need to look at our business, at our building plans, and ensure that there are facilities that are built with the necessary infrastructure that would enable them to resist or to obtain as minimal damage as possible as a result of the hurricane. And on this slide, we also have amateur radio operators. And one of the things coming out of one of the lessons we learned was that the amateur radio operators seem to operate apart from the official structures for disaster management. And so consequently, there was no real plan for multiple country disaster. So two things about the National Amateur Radio Operators, the ham operators, is that we have to cultivate a new class of ham operators, a new generation of ham operators. And the second thing is that we have to somehow officially incorporate them in the national disaster response, right? And this is something that this was a major failing identified by my good friend from the IARU. The inability of, there's no plan for them to follow in this extreme case of disaster. The other thing is the satellite phones. This is always a mystery to me. We are in the Caribbean. We experience storms and hurricanes on a regular basis. Why is it that every time a hurricane hits, we have to be asking the ITU to arrange for it? I think it was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers. We should have a cache of satellite phones that are available to key agencies, ready, always charged, to enable us to function, some basic communication. And the whole issue about the relationships, are we talking to the satellite companies beforehand so that we could make use of these handheld devices? These are things that have to be put in place before a hurricane strikes. And so you certainly have to establish the plans, but more than that, you have to exercise these systems periodically. And there must be a communication plan for ordinary citizens, for all of the agencies involved, so that when an emergency strikes, people know what to do, or where to go, or who to call. These plans have to be exercised regularly. You have to make sure that your devices are charged and run simulations periodically, so people are familiar, so that when the disaster strikes, they don't have to run, okay, when is it, what section says this sort of thing. And so people are aware. So these are things that need to be put in place before the disaster strikes. And when the hurricane does hit, this is an actual map of one of the hurricanes that passed over the region. And I don't know how plain you could see, but it covers many countries. many countries are being affected simultaneously. When the hurricane strikes, you then execute your plan, which would have been put in place and exercised over from time to time. So now, so I'm going specifically to the use of some of the ICT tools. Satellite imagery is amazing. And when you look at this was Dominica, some scenes from Dominica before and after. If you could arrange to have the satellite images before the disaster, before the hurricane strikes, then if one country is totally devastated, there must, and this is part of the plan, the relationship building, somebody in another country must be able to look at it and say, oh my goodness, Dominica is completely wiped out here. There's nothing here. And look at, you could see very clearly where the devastation is. And based on that information, you have an idea now where resources have to be developed. And if you have your plan, your relationship, your escalation plan in place, then you know who to call. And if 4 countries have been devastated, there's nobody in those countries who could make a call. There must be a 5th country in your planning who will take on the responsibility to report on behalf of those countries. And these sort of linkages is very important that they be put in place. I think with some of the IT rules and the Tampere treaty, it requires the country that has been hit by the disaster to make the request and make the report. Well, some countries will not be in any position to make any sort of request depending on the level of the devastation. So satellite imagery is a tool that could be very useful in being able to identify the nature of the emergency and the devastation. And if you have, as I said, a 21st century government, one in which all of your information is digitized and stored, after you have returned to some degree of normalcy, the government can begin to function because you will be able to, as I said, repatriate the information about your country, which may be resident in some other country, or in a cloud, who knows, it could be a Caribbean cloud. You'd be able to at least restore some of your functions, your information functions as far as your government is concerned. So we are certainly, our hearts are really broken for the countries that have been devastated by these hurricanes in 2017. But I think it is an opportunity to pause and think. And we understand that there's an urgency to rebuild, but I want to caution and encourage, don't rebuild what was lost, but rebuild with the intent of resilience and being able to survive the next hurricane. Because I thought Cleveland's graph this morning with the escalation of disasters was very, very stark. And therefore, we are pretty confident that next year there will be a few storms, and who knows, there may be some hurricanes, and maybe we will escape next year. But the year after, or 5 years down the road, there's a good chance, given the effects of climate change, that we will be revisited by perhaps a more violent set of storms. So we cannot afford to rebuild what we've lost, but we have to focus on building for resilience. And we have to introduce policies, and I'm going to go into another little discussion here for accelerated recovery. We need to use technology and what we put down now as part of our recovery plan. The technology will enable us to leapfrog. So if you had a paper-based manual, very, very manual government, and you've lost all your records, this is the opportunity to use the technology to leapfrog to 21st century government. And of course, we could use technology to enhance the sustainability, to build smart countries, to collaborate and to integrate at greater levels, making use of the technology. So for those countries, so those of our colleagues whose countries have been devastated, pause and think and see how we could use the technology to leapfrog. Then we will plan and act, and the CTU is ready to support you. Now, this brings me to the end of one aspect of my presentation. As Nigel had indicated, as Nigel indicated, we have been talking within the Secretariat about the use of ICT for Caribbean preparation, recovery, and resilience. And I just want to share some of the thoughts that we've been having. These ICT-enabled emergency initiatives to foster long-term resilience. Yes, and considering that one of the key factors for sustainable development is information and communication technologies, then it follows that ICTs must be deployed in managing disaster preparedness, detection, mitigation, and accelerating recovery efforts. And we have a number of new emergency initiatives that effectively employ ICTs, and these are needed in the following areas: policy, legislation, and regulation. And I think someone this morning mentioned the need for policies that foster a competitive environment. And so I'm looking at the network in infrastructure, and I'm thinking that policies that allow or require network operators to share common infrastructure in building out their networks, that is something that we need to consider. And then we should require, or perhaps that our network operators maintain a minimum level of communications between key individuals or agencies throughout the disaster situation. And this could be through the provision, for example, of satellite phones. Then we want to establish appropriate infrastructure to ensure rapid restoration of basic public communication services within a minimum time frame. And operators should consider some of the main transport systems in key areas, perhaps the underground conduits, parkable tower sites. Is that something we could consider? Something that you could lay flat? I'm not saying that this should be for the whole of the network, but for key areas, so that when a disaster is coming, you could park. I know they used to park satellite dishes. I don't know what they used to do for the towers. I'm not saying that this would be a requirement throughout the entire country, but in order to minimize some very basic level of communications, that might be something that we consider. Wi-Fi, WiMAX, and TV white space technology deployment, transportable communication system. And if you looked at an emergency operating center as a disaster-resistant facility, that means its construction will withstand earthquake, will zone, I can't remember the zones anymore. So it will stand the earthquakes and the hurricanes. Then you could store, for example, transportable communication systems, right? So they are protected during the time of the disaster, and you wheel them out and roll them wherever you need to transport them to provide some basic level of communications, right? So we spoke about this, so that emergency operating center could be one of those things. Right, and what we should require is that when in times of a disaster, a certain amount of cooperation between the service providers, so that if at all possible, all available service network infrastructure, it doesn't matter which operator, all of the serviceable infrastructure could be cobbled together to give you a working system that provides communication services, and this would be for a limited period of time. And for the governments, some of the things that I think the governments need to do, I already mentioned, digitize all government information, establish redundant repositories in other countries, share information on impending situations that may lead to disasters to national agencies and neighboring countries, other countries outside of your region, and international countries and organizations. Because if many countries are affected within the region, we may not even be able to help each other. We've heard about this, provide appropriate waivers to existing systems for taxation, duties, other charges, with permit requirements, and so on. Encourage hurricane and other natural disasters drills in the pre-hurricane season. And as I mentioned before, communication plan for the public to foster preparedness. And it may be that we need to suspend, we've spoken about this, regulatory barriers that may restrict the importation of telecommunications equipment, the use of radio frequency spectrum, and so on in natural disasters. And what I would like to see, I don't know what happens, but I think governments must take an interest in amateur radio operators and provide facilities for them. They provide a national service. And it could be in the off-season, off-hurricane season, in normal times, those facilities could be used to train and for building up that capacity to respond to disaster situations. I mentioned before, cultivate a new generation of ham operators and incorporate ham operators in the formalized response at the national level. I've spoken about a little bit already about the establishing relationships and keeping those relationships alive in normal times, right? And you have to talk to your other colleagues, Caribbean countries who can assist in disaster situations, and organizations and agencies that are essential for disaster. And I had a lot of time for disaster relief. And of course, we have to establish and document the system, the information pertaining to those streamlined systems and procedures for addressing disaster. And it is about keeping those relationships alive. Who's the best suited agency? Who's the best suited recovery agency? Your communication plans, your escalation plans, which countries can respond in cases of total devastation, who provides and who receives before and after satellite pictures, the network operating centers, do their procedures include infrastructure, communication equipment, and what are the protocols, the amateur radio operators, early warning systems, and the agencies, who are the agencies responsible for early warning alerts? And of course, the citizens, again, their understanding and awareness of what must be done. And something else we spoke to in our little document that we have, it's a need for post-mortems and review and evaluations. Who is responsible and who will be doing that in this case of the 21st of the hurricane season? Right, and in the case then, I'm not going to go any further, but we're working on this document which we will issue. But with respect to the post-mortem, I just want to pick an initiative very, very briefly. And we have been working with our collaborative partners, Packet Clearinghouse. They were supposed to be at this ministerial. Unfortunately, they were not there. ARIN, the American Registry of Internet Numbers for Internet Numbers, and Caribbean, the Caribbean Network Operators Group. And we are seeking to having a commission to investigate the failures to the 3 islands completely losing connectivity in the aftermath of the recent storms. We want to be able to assess the alternate infrastructure technologies and methods which will be more robust and resilient in the face of similar and expected violent weather in the future. And finally, produce a report with specific recommendations that our ministries, our regulators, our governments, our disaster agencies can follow. And we're looking at it in terms of the use of ICT and what were the failings and what could be done to use technology to minimize the difficulties or to mitigate the effects and minimize the. One second. Right, just sit off the desk. Give me 1 more minute, please. Right, and at this point, the organizations that are supporting this commission are the Caribbean Telecommunications Union, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the Caribbean Network Operators Groups. These are the regional organizations. The intergovernmental and international organizations are the American Registry for Internet Numbers and Packet Clearing House. And commercially, we're very happy to say we have a Cisco, Intel, Uni Registry. They would also support this commission to do a sort of post-mortem and reposition our ICTs in the whole scheme of disaster mitigation and recovery. And we envision that the commission will initially be 10 persons. We will have a 40-60 sort of split between Caribbeans and international members. And it will be a neutral, absolutely neutral commission in that none of the commissioners will be in the form, it will be from companies whose infrastructure have failed, nor companies seeking to compete with them. So we want to have this completely objective view of what happened and what failed and what we need to do. And we're looking at principally technical experts, some regulatory experts, and we imagine this as being a bit similar to the Challenger Shuttle Commission. We're going to gather the facts and the failures and try to understand where the weaknesses in the technology or in the use of technology or in the availability, if it had been available, where these vulnerabilities were, with a view of providing a report that would guide our planning for sustainable development in the future. And with that, I end. I thank you very much for your attention. And I think, yes, I can take my laptop too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, SG. You could post your questions to the debate. So we heard 3 presentations this afternoon. We heard from the GSMA, and they certainly advocated certain points that some of which again were raised by the SG, so things like regulatory flexibility, proper pre-planning. So we need to have our emergency communications infrastructure in place as well, and cooperation among operators, among other things. So we can open the floor now to some questions. There was one that I saw on the debate, which was someone was wondering about CDMA's group and us making sure that we coordinate well with them or do not overextend into their area of responsibility. Do you want to make a comment?
Absolutely. Our focus is really ICT related, right? And SEDEMA, yes, it uses ICT, but we want to take a broader view. We will certainly, and we have been collaborating with SEDEMA. Let me just start by saying that we have been collaborating with SEDEMA. It is not our intention to take any part of SEDEMA's work, but our focus is really on the ICT and the tremendous potential it offers in this at this time to help in preparedness and mitigation and recovery and accelerated recovery.
And I'll just add to that in our spectrum harmonization work, we had also involved CDEMA in a special workshop we had on emergency communications. This was held in Barbados in 2014, I believe it was. And what came out of that was that, certainly at that time, the frequency bands we were looking at were not being used at the time for our emergency communications. The CDEMA infrastructure pretty much was still at the lower frequencies, the high frequency and that sort of thing. So certainly there needed to be some development in terms of the systems that were in use. It has been 3 years, so I cannot say to what extent that has been improved at this point in time, but we certainly as CTU certainly have been seeking to bring our expertise in the ICT aspect of it into their overall disaster management picture, right? So we will continue to work closely with them and coordinate with them in terms of what we're doing. There is another comment that someone thinks that cloud services needs to be part of the solution, and time to talk about a Caribbean cloud. And I think that's a question I want to raise myself related to, and maybe we have some ministers in the room and some government policymakers in the room. My experience is that we've been cautious or concerned about having government information stored out of country. So in other words, using the cloud, who knows where your data will end up being stored, and who knows who will have access to it. And this particular comment relates to talk about a Caribbean cloud. So maybe we work together in CARICOM. We have an organization we call the Caribbean Community. And certainly from the recent experiences in particular, we can see the value in having some sort of emergency storage for information or data. So is there room for a solution like maybe we should set up something within CARICOM that is that worthy of consideration? And I would certainly like to hear some comments from the government policymakers in the room on that point.
Might I take up on that invitation, Nigel? I think for our purposes in Antigua, we have adopted a hybrid cloud topology for our network. And where there is non-essential data, non-sovereign data, we certainly utilize public cloud. But even at this moment, we are installing our own private cloud for government services. And I think there are possibilities of finding ways and means to back that cloud up so that we can have even redundancy. We have a disaster recovery site, even in Antigua's case. So there are ways of dealing with that. But I'm also aware that a number of the regional carriers, and this is not a cloud for any of them, but I am aware that Cable Wireless has a cloud-based service in Curacao, in the Caribbean. And there may be possibilities of looking at various versions of that hybrid topology to ensure that there is sufficient resiliency and redundancy built into the way of doing it. But you're correct in that it is wise policy to ensure that sovereign information, your state registries, and citizen information remains at all times within the confines and the controls of the state government.
But what happens if you have a devastating event, and is it not vulnerable to being lost if it is
even within the state, there can be geographic differences in terms of how you store the information. So you can look at that as well.
Well, I agree, except that typically the states are not that large, you know. And like we saw with Dominica, the eye of the hurricane passed over Dominica, so that means the entire country was impacted and impacted severely. So, I mean, I wasn't in Dominica, so I
So
cannot
let's
say
take that from another step level. So
yeah.
we determine that we build in a credit cloud and we put it in the country that is least likely to be hit by a hurricane. So we go to Trinidad.
No, that's
And
what I'm saying.
no, you're using as an example. And then using the event in Trinidad, you could specify and specify and specify. That's the point.
Yeah.
But there comes a point in time where statistically you can be reasonably sure that you can, within that array of your disaster recovery sites, have a reasonable assurance that you can recover in an appreciable period of time.
It's always a risk, and I guess that's a judgment that people would have to make. Um, I see Albert burning to make a comment on this particular point. Could I get could we get the mic in the middle of the room? Maybe it needs to be switched on. Right.
Okay, Albert Fernandez, wearing one of my hats from a previous life as regional IT manager for KPMG Eastern Caribbean, where I was doing IT audits. One of the things that which might add a comment to add to this particular exchange, one of the things that could help Caribbean territories, which is what we called for, particularly from Caribbean financial institutions in different countries, was that in addition to having the geographically diverse local backups, that they should also have at least one off-country backup, perhaps at a data center in another territory. Because I think the type of devastation that we saw in Dominica, I mean, we don't pray for it, but it's the kind of devastation that could wipe out a very large area, as you said, Nigel. So that if there is at least one, and we call it warm meaning that it's not immediate online backup. You may lose, some days of data, but at least if you have one offsite backup in another territory, knock on wood, maybe that territory will not be also devastated if you are devastated. And then by getting similar equipment, you can quickly restore your data from that other secure location. So it's just something to consider if the financial resources are available to governments to do that kind of.
Mm-hmm. Teresa?
I have to push my way in because I have to leave just now. But I just want to make a couple comments before I leave. One of the things that keep resounding in my mind is the words of the Dominican Prime Minister. Caribbean people are strong and Caribbean people are resilient. So I know this room and with all of us, we will come to some conclusion. But having said that, Canto had been working on our lessons learned from the immediate aftermath of the hurricanes that passed. We have been working closely with CDMO, and one of the things that we found lacking is the cohesiveness with power and telecoms. And one of the speakers there highlighted it earlier. And I just want to endorse what he said because in cases where networks were up and there was no power, people still could not communicate. So, in our own way, we have formed an alliance with the power company Carilec, and I'm sure the governments of the region can talk to them about working with their disaster preparedness office to form similar alliances. We've also been working closely with SIDAMA to get response scheme ready for not recovery, but for the assessment phase. And I wanted to highlight the fact that Cable and Wireless, Digicel, all the Kanto members work towards sending people with Sudama in countries like Anguilla, BVI, and St. Martin, and also Barbuda to help with the restoration. So that is a quick success factor that we have right here in the region. The other two things I want to mention quickly is Sonar. Sonar is an application. We've been talking about innovation by our own Caribbean people. And it's a product I proudly say of our annual hackathon from people right here in the region, Belize, and it's an emergency management system that right now is free for any government or company to use. It can be accessed via the Play Store emergency management. You're free to download it and send me your comments. It's Caribbean people doing their thing in a garage, and one of Canto's rule is to highlight it. The last comment is Sidema, but Kanto has two simulation exercise every year, pre-hurricane season and one right after the hurricane season. It's a very good exercise. It's conducted by Sidema, and some of our members and some of the governments have been participating, but it's a platform for all of the region to participate and see the gaps and the inefficiencies in disaster plans. And you all are welcome to join those. So my chairman is ready to leave, so we have to leave to another meeting now, but I wish the meeting all success.
Just before you leave, Sonar is SONAR.
SONAR is the Play Store, and it was developed by kids in the Belize.
Okay.
And
And the exercise you do at CDMO in how many countries is it done?
Well, so far, I think 8 countries have been actively participating. We always have the Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados. I can't name them right away,
Yeah.
but it is, and it's done through our disaster preparedness community. It is a very, very good exercise to do. Really good job of managing.
Okay. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Mr. Pravat?
It's not me. I'm
speaking
on behalf of Jerry George from the NTRC in St. Lucia.
St. Lucia, yes.
Yeah, and I want to thank him and a number of other participants who were also there, even though we had a little bit of a iffy time with the Zoom presentation system. He says, I agree with establishing a cloud within the Caribbean as opposed to within CARICOM. Simple approaches for each country slash major entity to provide excess capacity in their own facility while accessing capacity in partner facilities at a minimal cost beyond the local capacity costs.
Okay, so he's saying use excess capacity to, I guess I would keep the cost down.
And then the last debate comment there, that is also from one of the participants.
The greatest cost implication would be connectivity for replication and synchronization of data, rather than attempting to offer real-time full redundancy of data access. To build a warm or even a cold standby, and those costs would be affordable to the Caribbean states. So similar to what Albert was talking about, Albert's comment is, okay.
And then Shelley Ann Clark Hines from Trinidad and Tobago says, Jerry, that sounds like something to consider. We've been looking at the region and thinking that perhaps backup facilities could be located in Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, which are not necessarily the direct hurricane path. The issue with establishing Caribbean cloud is political issues with respect to those territories, France, etc., to have particular issues with the storage of information.
Yeah. Okay, so there are some thoughts there. Let me go to the key base, and I see one there for Mariah asking, can OneWeb be used as a regular radio communication system for a police department? And just while you're answering that, I don't recall if you said that one of OneWeb's key objectives would also relate to disaster management. Is it one of your stated key objectives as well, or not?
It is something that we are very focused on, and that's why we've been thinking about how to set up the infrastructure and how the terminals can be configured to support disaster response.
Okay.
But the answer to the question is yes. There can be multiple users on the terminals, and the terminals are configurable. So you can configure the terminal to have the local access to Wi-Fi or 3G or land mobile radio. There are a lot of options, and we would work with the customer, with the government entity, to determine what is the best solution.
So it could be police, fire, whoever, whatever they might want to need, what they might want to use it for.
Yes, and we're also working on solar-powered terminals. And also, I'd like to emphasize that they would be easy to maintain. So, serving remote areas, we don't want to have something, equipment that needs to be maintained every couple of months. I think that was raised earlier also. So, simple, streamlined. I've held one of the terminals in my hand. It literally is just like a pizza box. You can just put it on top of a school or put it on top of a house, and it can be solar-powered. And hopefully would allow for smooth, streamlined communications even after disasters.
Okay. There has been a media release that the OECS is preparing for Cloud for Development pilot, a Cloud for Development pilot. Is the CTU aware and involved? You know?
We have an MOU with the OECS.
We have
an MOU with the OECS, so we are supposed to be collaborating on a number of things, and I believe that this is one of the things that we should be collaborating on.
Okay.
I just want a follow-up comment from.
It's not a,
Sorry. Follow-up comment from Mr. George. He says he agrees with the political concerns. However, we can start with a coalition of the willing and seek to extend involvement afterwards.
yeah, definitely. And what can be done if, along with your country, the backup state also suffers a natural disaster? Well, you would have tried to cover your bases, and those are the what the actuaries call life contingencies. So if it is that both get impacted at the same time, I guess you will be impacted, but you can, I guess, prepare to the extent that you judge is reasonable and cost effective. Oh. All right. There was a poll that was up there earlier. Was that the results of the last poll that you were showing? So we apparently have two new polls that we would like you to respond to. This one relates to an earlier presentation. Do you believe that the APEX model shared for technology-enabled good governance can be applied to other sectors, apart from the judiciary and so on? Do you believe that the APEX model can be applied to other sectors? A, definitely. B, event. Oh, okay. Right, and the second one is, do you think that there should be a formal study of the recent disasters with a view to developing specific guidelines for more effective disaster response? A, as a matter of priority, B, yes, C, maybe, and D, not at this time. So, and some preliminary results there. Everybody so far says yes, it's really just a question of whether it's a matter of priority or yes. I would think so. And I would say that, I dare say that we've started studying and discussing some of what has happened right here in this particular forum. So I thank you all for your cooperation, your inputs, and so on. Okay, not seeing any more questions and being past the time, I will bring this particular session to a close. I would like you to thank the presenters. I think we learned something in terms of what's possible, and had quite a vibrant discussion. I'd like to thank you all for participating, and say thanks again to our sponsors, because we need to. Cable Wireless Business, URCA of Bahamas, Aaron Digital Group, ICANN, Incus, ISOC, and ISOC. Okay, so now we go to our afternoon break. The last item is a roundtable discussion, which I will ask, okay, it's approaching 3:30 now, which we want to start at 3:45. It's a roundtable discussion where we'll be discussing building consensus on the Internet and Privacy System like ICT space and for Caribbean disaster preparedness and so on, based on our discussions over the last 2 days. And that would be the last session. Mr. Wilson will share that one. And it's at 3:45. So let's take 15 minutes, take a liquid break, a comfort break, and let's get back. Thank you very much. You did thank the speaker, right?
over with them. Come with us. We have offset one organization.
Well, that was good. Everybody should go together.
But a lot of groups, everybody going to see. But I'm looking for 15 people.
I should have told them. Like,
let's tell them to come with us.
oh, good Lord. Look, this boy, young boy, the Incas.
Well, he coming with me.
Well, I thought that's what you got me. So,
So you're in.
oh, okay, yeah.
Right.
Right, okay. Yes, Nigel, thank you very much. I tell you, this is all going all over the place.
You see you? I need to ban you from this thing. Not you. Yeah, I'm banning you from this.
It's not that. I'm here trying to communicate with the people, so you get.
Right.
But at least I sorted out the volume.
We're going to fish right. We're meeting in the corridor. Lovely for supper. We have to do some yes, for dinner. Okay, you and your own. Yeah. I don't mind going to fish tomorrow. Well, yeah, and I'll find something to do. All right. I can book it like one organizer 15 people. I'm still busy. Kevin have me. I went to fish right. $5 to go. $5 to come back. It's $10. Yeah. Yeah. I went to fish right last night. Yes.
Yeah, who's doing the last section? So me.
Yeah. You just share.
Yeah.
Did you get
Who? Yeah, he has it.